The Mississippi River is a long, wandering spine through North America, and at its mouth the world gathers: water, wind, ambition, salt, and the commerce of two hemispheres. New Orleans sat like a jewel at that junction, a city of shutters, steeples, Creole mansions, and 1,000 gardens of mud and iron. It was a place where languages braided, French and Spanish accents wrapped around English, West African words threaded through, and the law itself wore different faces depending on who stood before it. To the merchant and the mariner, New Orleans was not merely a city, it was a choke point for the continent. Whoever controlled the river controlled the grain, the sugar, the cotton, the very traffic of an expanding nation. For the United States, then barely past its first dozen presidents and still raw from internal debate, keeping the Mississippi open was a strategic necessity. Western farmers needed the river to send their harvests down to sea. New Orleans port connected heartland abundance with Atlantic markets. To Britain, still flexing after Napoleonic victories in Europe, the city was a tempting prize. Disrupt the river, and you could cripple the American economy and the Republic's expansionary dreams. But in 1814, 1815, New Orleans had more in common with a border town than with an imperial capital. France had founded it. Spain had governed it. The United States had bought it in 1803 in the Louisiana Purchase, an audacious transaction that had seemed improbable and then inevitable in a single breath. The patchwork identity of the place made loyalty elastic. Creole planters who read French poetry could also bargain with merchants whose passports named other crowns. There were enslaved people whose lives were bound in chains, but whose presence shaped the city's labor and culture. There were free people of color, a distinct and often prosperous social group with property and trades and a fierce local identity. There were refugees from the Caribbean, exiles, smugglers, and the handful of men who had chosen lawlessness as a trade, pirates, privateers, and those who took their name from both. If you wanted to cue up the characters who would stand in Jackson's ranks, you would find them here. Swampers who knew the channels, hunters who could fire with greedy accuracy from a cane brake, planters who had carted cannon through the night on mule teams, and a surprising number of people who had once called themselves outlaws, including the Baratarian band that clustered around the figure of Jean Lafitte. Jean Lafitte, the privateer whose name would become legend, was not only a pillager. He was a man who understood trade routes, the value of contraband, and the necessary flexibility of politics. To him, national labels were negotiable. His priority was control of opportunities. When the British made contact, seeking to leverage Lafitte's intimate knowledge of the bayous and the ships that threaded them, he listened. When the Americans offered pardon in exchange for his cooperation, a pardon that could secure his fortune and standing, he weighed that too. For New Orleans, Lafitte's choice would be one of those brittle hinges on which the fate of cities swings. But if Lafitte was a story's privateer, Andrew Jackson was its hammer. Jackson came to New Orleans as a man formed by frontier skirmishes, dogged, quick-tempered, pious in a private way, and implacable in a fight. He had killed men, ordered executions, and loved the language of decisive action. In a nation still teaching itself how to govern and who it would let govern, Jackson looked like the embodiment of a certain American myth, the rugged man who carved order from chaos. He arrived in late November, and by early December was moving to weld whatever forces he could gather into a fighting force. His was not the polished, Europeanized command of the British. It was instead a jury-rigged assemblage of volunteers, regulars, militia, free black troops, native allies, French Creoles, and gray-clad backwoodsmen. Contemporary New Orleans did not have the tidy lines of a modern city. It was a marshy place, cut by drainage canals, with levees that barely held the water at bay. Winter here was dull and damp. The air smelled of brackish silt and wood smoke. The approaches to the city ran along a narrow neck of land with marsh on either side. That geography made the place both defensible and treacherous. A few well-placed obstacles could delay and shape the approach of a disciplined army, especially if those obstacles were built by men who understood mud the way seamen understood weather. The British, however, carried something more than maps across the Atlantic. Their men were cold-hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. In Europe, they had squared off against massed artillery and battalions, against columns and disciplined formations. They had learned to storm fortified places and to take them by weight of steel and the mobility of their logistics. Britain's commanders in the campaign for New Orleans believed they could bring that discipline to bear against the Americans. They could, they thought, strike fast and take the port, and thus cut the young republic's artery. What they did not fully appreciate was the way local knowledge would blunt military playbooks. This was not late-war Europe. The soil ate fascines and ladders. Marshes swallowed an advancing column. Humidity rotted canvas. Night rose suddenly, thick with fog. Moreover, the Americans were not an amorphous rabble. They were a fierce, stubborn mixture of militias who saw defense of their homes as a sacred act, and of professional soldiers who had tasted service in other theaters and carried those lessons with them. They also had, tucked into their defensive line, men who had nothing to lose and who would not give quarter. Escaped slaves who saw in Jackson's defense the slim chance of bargaining survival, and fighters who had long lived outside the reach of tidy laws. New Orleans had been a city of bargains for a century. Bargains between crown and colonist, between slave and free, between the sea and the land. Those bargains meant loyalties could be bought and forged by practical arrangement. When the British made overtures to local smugglers and privateers, they offered pardon, goods, and sometimes promises that would be sweet to men who had been pushed to the margins. But the Americans, in the figure of Andrew Jackson, offered something else. A chain of command that promised protection to the city itself, and a hard-minded pragmatism that could turn privateers into tactical assets and farmers into breastworks. When Jackson sent scouts into the surrounding plantations and along the river, he was not merely scouting terrain. He was assembling a portrait of a community's ability to fight. He learned where men kept their rifles, who could move a field gun on a swamp road, and which planters could spare wagons for entrenching. He sent couriers to New Orleans' diverse neighborhoods. He met with free men of color whose militias had their own traditions of bearing arms, men who wanted, above all, to be recognized as men with equal stakes in the city's survival. He also had to deal with raw tensions. A slaveholding society contained bitterly different visions of who would inherit liberty after a successful defense. Which is to say, this was a fragile alliance held together by necessity more than common ideology. Yet necessity can be stronger glue than agreement. In the grinding minutes before battle, a shared fear and a shared stake in the city were binding. Across the river, in the British camp, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham inspected his formations and thought in cool strategy. Reinforcements, supplies, trained regiments. He had what the books taught him. Yet to march inland from the Gulf meant threading a narrow line of approach, negotiating an intimate knowledge of the local waterways, and committing to a siege or an assault that would tax even the hardiest soldiers. It was not a contest of textbook maneuvers alone. It was a test of improvisation and will. Back in town, the women shuttered their windows differently than they once had. Blacksmiths hammered rounds late into the night. Farmers answered drum calls.
Tales moved through the markets and the cafes, rumors of British ships, of parleys, of secret deals with smugglers, and of a general who would accept no hesitation. Each rumor bent the city's atmosphere into a thicker thing, more urgent and more raw. As the town prepared, no one could know, absolutely, the details of the day to come. That ignorance is the engine of narrative. The small and local decisions, the late-night weighing of options, the backroom bargains, all those things combined into something that no one commander could have controlled entirely. And so a ragtag defense took shape. A line of cotton bales, a hastily dug rampart, a few cannons sighted behind a bend, and volunteers who had been plucked from farms and taverns and ports. History remembers the big names and the big dates: Jackson,